July 1944, Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, Central Germany. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche walked toward Hangar 7 with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. In front of him, under the light filtering through bomb-damaged skylights, sat an aircraft he had never seen before. An American Vought F4U Corsair with its distinctive inverted gull wings and long nose that made it look like a predator ready to pounce. The Corsair had arrived at Rechlin 3 weeks earlier, transported by ship from Norway after an emergency landing. Tail number JT-404, Royal Navy. Lerche had tested dozens of captured Allied aircraft, Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, even a B-17. But this one was different. The Corsair had a legendary reputation in the Pacific. The Japanese called it Whistling Death for the distinctive sound of its engine in a dive. Luftwaffe Command wanted answers. Could the Corsair compete with the FW-190 and BF-109? What were its weaknesses? And most importantly, what made this aircraft so lethal? July 18, 1944. Sky over occupied Norway, near the port city of Bodø. Lieutenant Mathuli of the Royal Navy was piloting his Corsair JT-404 on a reconnaissance mission when the engine began losing power. Fuel system problem. Mathuli had two options: attempt to reach the carrier HMS Formidable in the Norwegian Sea, or look for an emergency landing. He chose the second. Too risky to attempt a water landing in rough seas. He spotted an open field near Bodø and brought the Corsair down. Hard landing, but controlled. The aircraft was intact. Mathuli destroyed the radio and attempted to set fire to the cockpit, but German troops arrived before he could complete the destruction. For the Germans, it was an incredible stroke of luck. The Corsair was practically intact. Only minor damage to the landing gear and fuel system, repairable. And most importantly, it was an F4U-1A, the latest version with the raised cockpit that improved pilot visibility. The local Wehrmacht command immediately contacted Berlin. The order was clear: transport the aircraft to Germany as quickly as possible. The problem? The Corsair couldn't fly. The fuel system damage required spare parts the Germans didn't have, and disassembling the aircraft for ground transport would take weeks. The solution was bold: load it onto a ship from Narvik and transport it by sea to a German port, then by rail to Rechlin. It took 18 days. The Corsair arrived at Rechlin on August 5th, covered in salt spray and with additional minor corrosion damage. But it was there, and it was flyable once the fuel system was repaired. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring personally ordered the evaluation. The Luftwaffe was losing air superiority over Europe. American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, were decimating German formations. If the Corsair was coming to the European theater, the Luftwaffe needed to know how to fight it. The task fell to Lerche. At 27 years old, he was already one of the most experienced test pilots at Rechlin. He had flown over 60 different aircraft types, including 25 captured Allied planes. His reports were precise, technical, brutally honest. But the Corsair presented a unique challenge. Unlike the P-47 or Spitfire, which German pilots had encountered in combat and could describe, the Corsair was a mystery. No Luftwaffe pilot had faced one over Europe. All intelligence came from Japanese reports in the Pacific. Reports that described the Corsair as nearly invincible in the hands of a skilled pilot. Lerche spent 2 days studying the aircraft on the ground. The engineering was impressive. The inverted gull wing design allowed for a shorter, stronger landing gear, while maintaining propeller clearance. The cockpit, raised in the F4U-1A version, offered better forward visibility than earlier models. The 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings carried 400 rounds per gun, devastating firepower. But numbers on paper meant nothing. Lerche needed to fly it. The Corsair test was scheduled for August 8, 1944. Clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions. Lerche arrived at Hangar 7 at 0600 hours. The ground crew had completed the pre-flight checks, fuel tanks full, all systems operational. Lerche climbed into the cockpit. Immediately, he noticed differences from German fighters. The seat position was higher, giving excellent visibility over the long nose. The control stick was centered between his legs, not offset like in the BF-109. The instrument panel was logically organized, easy to read. He started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp roared to life. 2,000 horsepower, twice the power of a BF-109G's Daimler-Benz engine. The entire aircraft vibrated with raw power. Lurcher taxied to the runway. The Corsair's long nose completely blocked forward visibility on the ground. He had to weave side to side to see ahead, a technique he had learned from captured American pilot interrogations. At the runway threshold, he pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was brutal. The Corsair leaped forward, tail up almost immediately. At 80 knots, Lurch pulled back on the stick. The Corsair climbed like nothing he had ever flown. Lurch leveled off at 3,000 meters and began his evaluation protocol. First, basic handling characteristics. He banked left, then right. The Corsair responded smoothly, but with noticeable heaviness at low speed. The ailerons required more force than a FW190. This matched Japanese reports. The Corsair was not a dogfighter at low speeds. Second, acceleration. Lurch pushed the throttle to full power and watched the airspeed indicator climb. 300 knots, 350 knots, 400 knots. The Corsair kept accelerating with no sign of strain. At 420 knots, nearly 485 miles per hour, Lurch pulled back the throttle. The FW190A8, Germany's frontline fighter, topped out at 408 miles per hour. The speed advantage alone was significant, but it was the third test that revealed the Corsair's true nature. Lurch climbed to 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, and began a series of vertical maneuvers. First, a simple zoom climb. Full throttle, pull up sharply, see how high the aircraft could climb on momentum alone. The Corsair shot upward like a rocket. Lurch watched the altimeter spin. 6,500 meters, 7,000 meters, 7,500 meters. The aircraft was still climbing when it finally stalled at 8,200 meters, a 1,200-meter gain on pure energy. He tried it again, this time from a dive. Rolled inverted, pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated to 450 knots, then pulled hard into a vertical climb. The G-forces crushed him into the seat. The Corsair's airframe groaned, but held. The altimeter spun wildly. 8,000 meters, 8,500 meters, 9,000 meters. Lurch held the climb until the aircraft stalled at 10,400 meters, over 34,000 feet. This was the revelation. The Corsair wasn't designed for turning dogfights like a Spitfire or BF-109. It was designed for vertical combat, boom and zoom tactics. Dive on the enemy from above, use superior speed and power to climb back to altitude, repeat. The massive R2800 engine gave it energy advantages no German fighter could match. Lurcher tested the theory. He set up a simulated attack run. Dive from 7,000 meters to 4,000 meters at maximum speed. Pull out, then execute a maximum performance climb back to 7,000 meters. The dive was terrifying. The Corsair accelerated past 500 knots, over 575 miles per hour. The airframe shuddered, but remained stable. At 4,000 meters, Lurch pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces were crushing. He estimated 6 Gs, maybe more. His vision tunneled, but the Corsair pulled through cleanly. Then the climb. Full throttle, optimal climb speed. The aircraft rocketed upward. Lurcher checked his stopwatch. 2 minutes 40 seconds to regain 3,000 meters of altitude. He had flown the FW190A-8 through the same maneuver 2 months earlier. Time to climb. 4 minutes 15 seconds. The Corsair was 40% faster. Lurch's mind raced through the tactical implications. If American pilots used these tactics over Europe, and they would, because it was the only logical way to exploit the Corsair's strengths, German fighters would be at a catastrophic disadvantage. The BF-109 and FW-190 were designed for horizontal turning combat. They could outturn a Corsair at low to medium speeds. But if the Corsair never committed to a turning fight, if it stayed fast and used vertical maneuvers, German pilots would be chasing an opponent they could never catch. Lersch tested the gun platform's stability. He rolled into a 30-degree dive, lined up on a ground reference point, and squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted. The recoil was surprisingly mild. The Corsair's heavy airframe absorbed it easily. The gun sight remained steady. Lersch could keep the target centered, even while firing full bursts. He compared it mentally to the FW-190's armament. The A8 carried two 13mm machine guns and four 20mm cannons, devastating firepower. But the recoil made accurate shooting difficult, especially in high-speed attacks. The Corsair's 6.50 cals delivered less punch per round, but the stability meant more rounds on target. After 35 minutes of flight, Lersch had his preliminary assessment. But there was one more test he needed to run, the test that would reveal the Corsair's most dangerous capability. Lersch climbed back to 7,000 meters and set up for a simulated combat scenario. Scenario: a Corsair diving on a German formation from above. The German fighters see the attack and brake, standard defensive maneuver. The Corsair overshoots, but instead of trying to turn with the German fighters, it uses its speed to extend away and climb back to altitude. Question: how long would it take a FW-190 to climb back to the Corsair's altitude and re-engage? Lersch rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, simulating the Corsair's attack run. He let the speed build to 480 knots, then pulled out hard at 4,000 meters. The G-forces slammed him into the seat. His vision grayed at the edges. The Corsair groaned, but held together. At the bottom of the pullout, Lersch immediately transitioned into a maximum performance climb. Full throttle, optimal climb speed of 130 knots indicated airspeed. The R2800 engine roared. The Corsair clawed for altitude. He started his stopwatch. At 5,000 meters, 1 minute 15 seconds elapsed. At 6,000 meters, 2 minutes 20 seconds elapsed. At 7,000 meters, 3 minutes 35 seconds elapsed. Lersch leveled off and checked his fuel. Still adequate. He noted the time in his kneeboard, then ran the numbers in his head. He had flown the same profile in a FW-190A8 2 months earlier. Time to climb from 4,000 to 7,000 meters. 5 minutes 50 seconds. The difference was staggering. The Corsair could execute a boom and zoom attack, extend away, and be back at fighting altitude a full 2 minutes and 15 seconds before a pursuing FW-190. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In air combat, that was an eternity. But the implications went deeper. Lersch realized that the Corsair's energy advantage created a tactical paradox for German pilots. If you dove after a Corsair to pursue, you burned energy trying to catch an aircraft that was faster than you. By the time you gave up the chase, you were low on altitude and energy, vulnerable. If you didn't pursue, the Corsair simply climbed back to altitude unmolested and set up another attack. You couldn't ignore it. Either way, the German pilot lost. Lersch had seen this pattern before in combat reports from the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots flying American Lend-Lease P-39 Airacobras used similar tactics against BF-109s, but the P-39's performance advantage was marginal. The Corsair's advantage was overwhelming. He ran one more test, simulated defensive scenario. A Corsair is bounced from above by a FW-190. The Corsair pilot sees the attack and reacts. What are his options? Lersch rolled into a hard defensive brake, maximum G-turn to force an overshoot. The Corsair's heavy controls fought him. The turn rate was mediocre compared to a FW-190. If this were a real engagement, the German pilot would have a firing solution within seconds. But then Lersch did what an experienced Corsair pilot would do. He rolled wings level, pushed the throttle to the firewall, and accelerated away in a shallow dive. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 300 knots. 350 knots. 400 knots. At 420 knots, Lerche pulled into a climbing turn, not tight, but fast and energy-conserving. He checked his watch. 15 seconds from the initial break to complete separation from the theoretical attacker. A FW-190 pilot would have perhaps 3 to 4 seconds of firing opportunity before the Corsair was out of range and climbing away. And if the German pilot tried to follow into the climb, the Corsair would outclimb him and reverse the engagement. Lerche understood now why the Japanese called it whistling death. It wasn't just the sound, it was the inevitability. A well-flown Corsair was nearly impossible to kill because it never had to fight on your terms. But no aircraft was perfect. Lerche spent the next 10 minutes probing for weaknesses. He tested slow-speed handling. Below 150 knots, the Corsair became sluggish. The heavy ailerons required significant force to roll. In a slow-speed scissors maneuver, a common dogfighting situation, a FW-190 or BF-109 would have a decisive advantage. The problem was getting the Corsair into that situation. A disciplined pilot would never let it happen. Lerche tested the stall characteristics. He pulled the nose up, bleeding off speed, waiting for the brake. At 85 knots, the left wing dropped sharply, a vicious stall with little warning. The Corsair snap-rolled inverted before Lerche could react. He recovered easily, but the lesson was clear. Don't slow down in combat. He tested visibility. The raised cockpit of the F4U-1A was a significant improvement over earlier models, but the long nose still created a massive blind spot directly ahead and below. In a turning fight, a German pilot could exploit this, slide into the blind spot and stay there. Again, the problem was forcing the engagement. If the Corsair never committed to a turn, the blind spot didn't matter. Lerche tested the dive. He pushed the nose over and let the speed build. 450 knots, 480 knots, 500 knots. At 520 knots, over 600 miles per hour, the controls became extremely heavy. The aircraft wanted to continue diving. Pulling out required both hands on the stick and significant effort. This was a real limitation. In a high-speed dive, the Corsair pilot had to plan his pull-out carefully. If he misjudged and dove too fast, he might not be able to pull out at all, or he'd pull so hard he'd black out from G-forces. But even this weakness was marginal. The FW-190 had similar dive limitations, and the Corsair's superior power meant it could afford to dive less steeply and still maintain a speed advantage. After 45 minutes of flight, Lerche had his assessment. He throttled back and began his descent back to Rechlin. As he flew the landing pattern, weaving side to side to see past the long nose, Lerche mentally composed his report. The conclusions were clear, and they were devastating. Lerche landed at 0745 hours. The ground crew swarmed the Corsair, checking for any damage from the test flight. There was none. The aircraft was as solid as it looked. Lerche walked directly to the technical office and began writing his report. He worked for 3 hours straight, documenting every observation, every measurement, every tactical implication. The report was 14 pages long. The conclusions were blunt. The Vought F4U Corsair represents a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. It is not optimized for traditional turning combat. Instead, it exploits superior power, speed, and energy retention to dictate engagement terms. Against this aircraft, conventional German fighter tactics are inadequate. Lerche detailed the performance data. Maximum speed, 420 plus knots at sea level, 485 plus miles per hour, 15% faster than FW-190A8. Climb rate, 40% superior to FW-190A8 in combat climb profile. Energy retention, exceptional, can execute multiple boom and zoom attacks without significant altitude loss. Armament, 6.50 caliber machine guns, stable platform, adequate firepower. Weaknesses, poor low-speed maneuverability, heavy controls, vicious stall characteristics, limited forward visibility. Then came the tactical assessment, the section that would cause the most controversy. Recommended defensive tactics against F4U Corsair. Avoid engagement if possible. The Corsair's energy advantages make it extremely difficult to defeat in combat. If engagement is unavoidable, force slow-speed maneuver in combat. This is the only regime where German fighters have an advantage. Never pursue a Corsair in a climb or dive. You will lose energy and become vulnerable. Exploit the Corsair's forward visibility limitations in turning combat, but only if the Corsair pilot commits to the turn. Attack only when holding significant altitude advantage, 1,500 plus meters. Even then, expect the Corsair to escape if the pilot is competent. Primary conclusion: the F4U Corsair is superior to all current German fighter aircraft in the energy fighting regime. If deployed to the European theater in significant numbers, it will pose a severe threat to Luftwaffe operations. Lärcher signed the report and submitted it through channels. He knew what would happen next. The report would go to the Technisches Amt, technical office, then to the Generalstab, general staff, and eventually to Göring himself. And Göring would be furious. 3 days later, Lärcher was summoned to Berlin. The meeting was tense. A Generalstab officer, Lärcher never learned his name, questioned every conclusion in the report. Was Lärcher certain about the performance data? Had he considered that the captured Corsair might have been modified? Was he aware that his assessment contradicted intelligence reports from the Pacific? Lärcher stood by his findings. The data was accurate. The Corsair was exactly as capable as his report indicated. Perhaps more so, since he had only 45 minutes of flight time to explore its full envelope. The officer's response was chilling. Your technical observations are noted. However, the tactical conclusions are premature. The Corsair is a naval aircraft. It will not be deployed to the European theater in significant numbers. Your report will be classified and distributed on a need-to-know basis only. Lärcher understood. The report was being buried, not because it was wrong, but because it was too honest. He returned to Rechlin and continued his work. Over the next 6 months, he would test 14 more captured Allied aircraft. Each report documented the same uncomfortable truth. Germany was losing the technological war. But the Corsair report had a strange afterlife. Copies circulated among Luftwaffe fighter units through unofficial channels, pilots sharing information that official command wouldn't provide. By late 1944, German pilots who had never seen a Corsair knew its capabilities and weaknesses. It didn't matter. The Corsair never came to Europe in large numbers. It remained primarily a Pacific theater aircraft, where it dominated Japanese fighters, exactly as Lärcher had predicted. The irony wasn't lost on Lärcher. He had discovered the truth about one of the war's most lethal fighters. But the discovery changed nothing. Hans Werner Lärcher survived the war. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Rechlin, he fled west and surrendered to American forces. His expertise was immediately recognized. The U.S. Army Air Forces recruited him to test captured German aircraft, the reverse of his wartime role. After the war, Lärcher wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, published in 1956, included detailed accounts of testing Allied aircraft, including the Corsair. The book became a primary source for aviation historians studying comparative aircraft performance in World War II. Lärcher remained fascinated by the Corsair throughout his life. In interviews decades later, he called it the most impressive fighter I ever flew, and I flew over 60 types. He particularly admired the engineering philosophy. Design an aircraft around a specific tactical doctrine, then execute that doctrine ruthlessly. The Corsair's combat record validated Lärcher's 1944 assessment. In the Pacific, it achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters. Marine and Navy pilots who flew it called it the best fighter of the war. The Whistling Death lived up to its reputation. But Lärcher's report raised a deeper question about military intelligence and institutional honesty. He had provided accurate, actionable intelligence about a potential threat. The Luftwaffe command chose to suppress it rather than confront uncomfortable truths about German technological inferiority. This pattern repeated throughout the German military in 1944 to 1945. Officers who reported honestly about Allied capabilities were accused of defeatism. Intelligence that contradicted official narratives was buried. The result was strategic paralysis, commanders making decisions based on wishful thinking rather than reality. Lerche's Corsair test was a microcosm of this failure. One test pilot, 45 minutes of flight time, and a 14-page report that told the truth. And the truth was ignored. The lesson extends beyond World War II. In any organization, military, corporate, governmental, the willingness to hear uncomfortable truths is the difference between adaptation and collapse. Lerche provided the truth. The Luftwaffe chose collapse. Hans Werner Lerche died in 1993 at age 75. His legacy is the honest assessment of over 60 aircraft types, including some of the most advanced fighters of World War II. He flew the Corsair once for 45 minutes in August 1944. It was enough to understand everything: